This is a download from BFM 89.9, the business station.
Hey there, you're listening to the evening edition. I'm Kelvin Yee. Just a quick heads up, on the show today, it involves some content that may be offensive to some audiences. We'll be exploring the N-word to look at its history and place in culture today. So we'll be playing examples of it in clips and in interviews. And to illustrate the point, they won't be censored or bleeped for the purposes of this story. With that, if you have any kids in the car with you or are just uncomfortable with the nature of this show, this might be the time to tune out, or you can listen to the show at your own convenience by downloading the podcast. Okay, now that's out of the way, let's begin the show. So if you're like me and you consume a lot of American media, you would have heard or at least be familiar with it before. You hear it in movies.
Drugs? Right. Well, why you want to be a narc?
I want to make detective.
There you go. You can do it. Stick with me. You can do it.
I will do anything you want me to do.
My nigga.
You hear it in music. It's the N-word. The word's use is not without controversy. Like when Larry Wilmore, a black comedian and one of the hosts on Comedy Central, used the N-word at an event where President Barack Obama was present.
We turn now to a new controversy over an old word, the N-word. Last week, comedian Larry Wilmore hosted President Obama's final White House Correspondents' Dinner. He ended his set by noting the historic nature of being the first black president, and he used the term he says he knew would trigger criticism.
Words alone do me no justice. So, Mr. President, if I'm going to keep it 100, yo, Barry, you did it, my nigga. Did it.
Of course, it was controversial, generating a lot of headlines. I was in attendance that night,
Why does this word cause so much uproar in America? What are its origins? What baggage does it carry? Who can say it? If so, in what instance? Should the word be used at all? Hello, I'm Kelvin Yee and you're listening to Lingo, the show that's about a relationship with language, how it goes beyond communication, and the impact it has on our lives, cultures, and traditions. This week, we explore the N-word, and we get 2 points of view on the matter. Now, to understand why the word is sometimes called the most offensive word in the English language, or, well, at least in America, I spoke to someone who actually taught a course in a university on the N-word.
My name is Dr. Neal Lester. I am a professor of English here at Arizona State University in Tempe, Arizona.
Dr. Lester used to run a course on the N-word, but it's now expanded to a series of talks and workshops. He felt classes had limited reach, but what was the push that made him want to start this project in the first place?
Well, I think back in 2008, it was when then Senator Barack Obama was running for president, I had noticed that a proliferation of that word being used to refer to him in social media. And I had specifically come across a story in Florida where an 8th grade teacher had written on the board for the students that the word change, which had become a theme for then Senator Obama in that first election, that it was an acronym for Come Help an N-word Get Elected. Now, he wasn't so kind as to use the N-word. He actually spelled it out. And I was rather stunned by that because I don't necessarily have that word in my social circle or professional circles. So what I wanted to do was to sort of explore it. And my way of exploring it was to create a course so that I could learn about it as I was teaching about it.
In America, the issue of slavery is etched in its history. Those of us outside the US may be somewhat familiar with it, and that the word is strongly tied to it. But how exactly?
The history is actually not as complicated as people think it is, the American history of it, because it certainly has created a history internationally that has also become sort of my work now because of what happens in the States. But I think there's a kind of unique record of American race relations between black and white that word embodies. And the history that I have found most feasible in my understanding of the word came quite simply when European, and I say simply rather ironically, when Europeans and Spanish encountered Africans around the 1400s. And that initial encounter was more of a neutral descriptor, if we can talk about descriptors being neutral. So what I have made sense of is that the Europeans describe those black-skinned, dark-skinned individuals by describing them as negro. Well, negro in Spanish means black. And what was interesting is the quickness that it took to associate black bodies with all of those things that were negative and different from the Europeans. So it became primitive, savage, uneducatable, a little bit threatening, so that by the 1600s, when Africans arrived in the New World, there was this sense that that negativity had already taken the neutrality from that word that was a descriptor. And when I talk about that, what I mean to say is that typically a descriptor is neutral. But when the descriptor embodies a human, then that descriptor often takes on some value judgments. And in the case of negro, those associations, both denotatively and connotatively, with black bodies has persisted. And that word has just been a sign of that negativity that's associated with black people.
And that's just one chapter of that history.
Now, if you talk about it historically as well, what I like to do, because I consider myself a cultural critic, is I like to look not only at dates, when the word was used, because clearly it was used in the time of the antebellum times when slaves interacted with masters, and it became somewhat interchangeable with the word slave. But the word persisted even after slavery. And so what I like to look at, and I don't mean I enjoy looking at, what I find effective for audiences is to look at the ways in which that word was so woven into the American tapestry in the pop culture, in marketing, and of commercial products, in songs, in postcards. It was everywhere, cleaning products. And so that became part of the history that was not just about the word, but also the very grotesque exaggerations of images of black people that still persist in what we call Americana today. So for me, that history is not just about the first time somebody uttered it, because we can rarely find the first time it was uttered. What we can find often is the first time it was written down. But the first time it was written down does not necessarily mean that was the first time it was spoken. Now, I know that there have been others. Kendrick Lamar is one who has tried to argue that the word comes from Negus, and in his study, that has to do with kings and queens in Africa.
For an explanation to hold us, well, this is my explanation, straight from Ethiopia. Negus, definition, royalty, king royalty. Wait, listen, Negus. Description, black emperor, king ruler. Now let me finish. The history books overlooked the word and hide it. America.
Well, I also know that Tupac also tried to use that word as an acronym for some other kind of positive way of looking at blackness. What I don't find is that there's any connection between those two assertions about that history and how that word is being used socially today. So when I say the history is not very complicated, what I look at is the ways in which that history was not so much about whether people were saying the word, but it was how the people were treated who wore the label of that word, not as an individual identity, but rather as a group identity.
So that's just the history of the word. That leads to the next question. Despite the loaded history the word has, it's still used in hip-hop, in comedy, in movies. But why? We find out after this from Dr. Neal A. You're listening to Lingo on the Evening Edition, BFM 89.9.
Be free-minded. BFM 89.9.
Hey there, I'm Kelvin Yee and you're listening to the Evening Edition. This is Lingo, a show that's all about languages. Today, we're exploring the N-word, and earlier we touched on the history of the word with Dr. Neal A. Now, there are plenty of discussions within the African American community on whether the word should be used. Some have said it shouldn't be used at all. Some have tried to erase the word by literally burying it. That was done by the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People. The organization held a funeral for the word during one of its conventions. They had a coffin and a headstone. This was all symbolic, of course.
It was the NAACP that was triumphant in prevailing over niggers' attempt to define himself as nigger, a black person.
I say good riddance to the N-word, die N-word, and we don't want to see you around here no more.
There's also discussions within the community to reclaim the N-word. What that means is for a group to take back a word that was once used to disparage them and then make it empowering. In this case, it's the N-word. Another example is among girls and women, how the B word, the one that rhymes with itch, can be used positively. Does reclaiming the N-word work? Here's what Dr. Lester thinks.
Well, it's, one of the things that I've used is also this notion from author Toni Morrison, who says that you can't really reclaim something that you never had. So the way she says is that definitions belong to the definers, not to the defined. So if, in fact, we go with what I see as the most sensical history of that word when it was first uttered and about whom it was uttered, then it can't be something that black people created for themselves. So this notion that you can take it back suggests that you've owned it. Well, you can't own it if it was never yours. So the other problem with that is that if, in fact, black people in the United States were somehow treated differently than they were during the time when that word was really a badge of disparagement and negativity on so many fronts in our American history, then I could say that, yes, in fact, there may be some way that you can sort of perfume the ugliness of that word that's still associated with violence, but that persists today. It persists today in things that you see in social media. When President Obama was reelected, the word followed him again. Anytime anybody gets angry with any person, whether you are of dark skin or not, there is some variation of that word that can be used as an epithet to disparage, to degrade, and to punctuate as negative. So I can't quite see how, unless you can sort of soak out all the ugliness and the violence, whether it was the horrific nature of American slavery to the awful and ridiculous I don't even know what you call the rules of Jim Crow that also involve lynchings and castrations and burning down cities, and to the civil rights movement, the fights against desegregation, the refusal of letting little black kids study with little white kids, and you'd see food being poured on people sitting at a counter only wanting to be served, but also you could hear that sort of chant of calling those black young students the N-word. You see dogs biting black people, black children and adults in Birmingham. That word is associated with that experience. The Birmingham bombings, for example, the word is associated with the bombing of that church. The word is associated with Emmett Till, who was killed by two white men in 1954. So I don't understand how one can imagine that in the last, say, 30 years, with the advent of hip-hop, that you can somehow take a word and then drain it of all the negativity that was there for hundreds of years and still have some of that negativity present even in today's manifestations of race relations. So we may not have bodies hanging from trees as in Mississippi and other places in the South, but you still have economic segregation. You still have ways in which no matter what status you achieve in this country, that word can be used to pull you down to, one of the lowest kind of beings on the planet. So I am having problems really trying to figure out how one can sort of take that word and do anything with it, whether it be trying to change the spelling of it or the pronunciation of it. It seems a very futile choreography that seems rather desperate to claim something that is, I can't quite understand why it's worth claiming or reclaiming.
So, for the record, while Dr. Lester believes that the word can't be reclaimed because of its history, he doesn't think the word should be removed completely.
I have never said that the word should not be used. In fact, I've had a number of reporters who sort of want to move to that kind of binary. This is a very complicated word with a complicated history. If one is trying to recreate a historical moment, for example, then obviously the word needs to be used. If you're writing a play, if you are trying to recreate the civil, rights protest, and you've got placards and people saying, go back to Africa, and they're using this word, obviously you should use it. There was an incident also in 1993 in Brooklyn, New York, where two young black siblings were walking home, and they were beat up by a gang of 6 or 7 white males, and not only were they spray painted white, their faces, but they were also baptized in that word. Well, when media wrote of an account of this word, they just simply said, a racial epithet was used. Well, there are any number of racial epithets, so that really doesn't document what happened in that particular circumstance. When a teaching organization, well, actually it's a social justice organization here, created a tool based on that event. It was an animation. They actually used the word because the kids say that's what they were saying as they were spray painting us. Then when a picture book based on the incident was published, the person, instead of using the word, said mud people. Well, mud people has a very different sort of ring and definition than that particular word. So to say that we should never use it, I think, is a stretch, because what I don't want to do is to imagine that we can sort of erase this from our American history. It is a part of our history. What I do think that people should be empowered to do is to think about what they're saying and not be controlled by this language. I've run into middle schoolers and, middle schoolers primarily, who, one in particular started to shake because after my presentation, he kept saying, I don't know how to stop saying the word. It's everywhere. My parents said, now these were younger than I, so their parents are younger than I. So I like to think, however, that if people sort of have bits and pieces of this history exposed to them and they look at these sort of myths about, there's a generational divide, there is, a double standard, blacks can use it and whites can't, we can take away its baggage, and people are confused, then that to me can move people to what I think is a more complicated conversation about language and identity and performance. And not so much about, are you saying that you shouldn't say it at all? Or, can black people say it but white people can't? We haven't come to a consensus on that. I mean, the NAACP here has tried to take the word out of the dictionary. They've tried to bury it. There are petitions going around. So there is no sort of double standard here relative to the language. The other thing is, yes, if in fact there is an inside-outside, this is not the only way in which those who are perceived on the inside have permission to say things that others on the outside can't. So there are lots of things going on when we talk about this word that apply to language more broadly.
Then that means that, in your opinion, the implications behind the word when someone uses it against another person, that hasn't quite changed since times of, say, slavery.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, I understand, black people in particular have been masters at changing words and meanings. And I use Michael Jackson, for example, when he, came out with his album Bad, or his song Bad, and bad became good. And, I know hip-hop has taken sort of ableist language like stupid, and that becomes good. And, we've changed spellings of things like fat. Is not about weight, but fat can be, that's really cool, P-H-A-T, so spell it differently. But that word, those aren't identities that are associated with sort of humans. Those are associated with other kinds of descriptions. It's an adjective. The N-word is an adjective. It's an adverb. It's a noun. It can be a verb. It can be all of these things. And what it cannot do, at least in my understanding, and I've looked at this from multiple perspectives, is it cannot be disconnected from the history that was extremely painful and often tragic for black Americans.
That leaves one more question. Who can use it? And what does it mean when the N-word is used on a black person today? Especially if the person saying it is not black.
And even those who are sort of imagining that, what it still creates is a hierarchy. Now, I've seen two black men fighting at a homeless service event that I was at, and as they were kicking each other into a bloody mess, they were using that word to each other. So what that suggests to me is it's not a term of endearment. I couldn't tell whether it was a G-A or a G-E-R. All I knew is that it was laced with the violence that was being used. Now, if people are saying that they're using endearingly, then I say, how is that being used endearingly that's any different from a master asking a slave, well, Dimby, how's my today? How is that any different? Because masters love their slaves in ways that masters love their pets. So I can't answer exactly how, what's in the mind of those who are saying it. I also can't speak to what's in the mind of the person to whom it is said. What I can say, however, is that I don't know that everybody understands or cares about the ways in which that word is still connected with a history, an American history that is still part of the present. And when this word has sort of crossed international boundaries, and I've talked to people in Sweden, and I've talked to people in Ireland, and I've talked to people in other parts of the country, and I also look at, in Malawi, there's a store called N-Words with the G-E-R. It's a hip-hop store. And I say part of what people have gotten is, well, somehow it's okay to say the word because it's in hip-hop and cool music, plus we don't have the American history for that. But I say the human capacity for empathy and for critical thinking transcends these sort of geographical borders and boundaries. So just because it's not my history doesn't mean that I can't understand how that is problematic to have that word come out of my mouth. And it's not that I need permission. It's, are you thinking about what's coming out of your mouth? And the answer is that most people don't.
So that's what Dr. Neal Lester thinks. After this, we get another point of view from our other guest, Britt Julius, on the use of the N-word and whether it can be reclaimed. She wrote an article in The Guardian that talks about her discomfort surrounding the use of the N-word. You're listening to Lingo on the Evening Edition, BFM 89.9.
Break from mediocrity. BFM 89.9.
Racism. We are not cured of.
Clearly.
And it's not just a matter of it not being polite to say nigger in public. That's not the measure of whether racism still exists or not. It's not just a matter of overt discrimination. Societies don't overnight completely erase everything that happened 200 to 300 years prior.
You're listening to Lingo on the Evening Edition. What you just heard was President Barack Obama on racism in America. He was interviewed by comedian Mark Maron. Obama had used the N-word to make a point about racism in the US. That caused some controversy. The White House responded to it in a statement that it wasn't the first time the president had used the N-word. He had used it a dozen times in his book, Dreams from My Father. Before the break, we heard from Dr. Neal A. He runs workshops and talks on the N-word. Now, let's hear from someone else to get another perspective.
My name is Britt Julius. I am a journalist and a critic and essayist based in Chicago.
Britt wrote a piece in The Guardian called "The N-word might be part of pop culture, but it still makes me cringe." The essay opens with, "It makes me wince." The N-word. Whatever the definition or pronunciation may be, it's always uncomfortable. I was curious why she personally felt uncomfortable with the N-word.
I think that I personally feel uncomfortable with the N-word for a couple of different reasons. I think one, I grew up in a household in which it wasn't used. My parents are both from the South, originally the Southern United States. They're from Alabama and from Mississippi. And, they migrated here to, the northern parts of the states, to Chicago in the 60s during the Civil Rights Movement. And I think because of that, we sort of grew up in a household where I was very much aware or had the sort of knowledge of what my parents experienced when they were kids. And I think because of that, just knowing sort of the history of it has always made me sort of deeply uncomfortable. And that's speaking with, sort of the N-word that ends with ER. And even with the one that sort of ends in A, that's, pretty frequently used within the Black community, especially for people who are in Gen X or millennials. It just hasn't really made sense to me in terms of context for use, right? Like, it is just in most ways a way of re-saying, friend or person. And I just don't see why there's any reason that it needs to be used or that it holds any sort of value. I understand why it is, I guess, the word has been, recontextualized or is now something that people sort of taken back and has changed sort of the meaning behind it. But I personally don't need to take back the word.
If the word wasn't used at home, and how did you first encounter the word, and how did your parents have that conversation with you?
I can't say for certain what my first interaction with the word was. I think my first memory of it, at least, was it being used when I was a child. We were drove down to Alabama for my mother, her family, and their family friends. They have this thing called the Tuscaloosa Reunion Club. It's in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And so every other year it's in Tuscaloosa. And then in the years in which it's not in Tuscaloosa, it takes place in other cities. We had driven down there. We were in a hotel, and my sister and I and my mother went down to the pool, and my sister and I wanted to swim in the pool. And, we jumped in, and there were two white kids who were also in the pool. They were there with their family. And as soon as we got in the pool, the mother sort of just was telling her kids, like, got to get out of the pool. Like, come on. Like, I don't want you swimming with them. I don't want you swimming with those, N-word. And that was the first time I heard it. My first memory of it, I should say. I didn't have the context for what it was, but I think as a child, you still can kind of perceive when something is wrong or upsetting, even if you don't have the language to describe why it's wrong and upsetting. My mother was deeply upset about that. And, she was saying things like, this is why I don't like going down to the South anymore. She sort of gave us a context in that it was a bad word, that sometimes people would use it, that people would be, more likely to use it in the South than in the North, but people will still use it in the North, which, now at 28, I can confirm is definitely true. But I think I didn't really have, even more, I grew up I was in school and outside of school, and I had sort of more context in terms of what the word was from talking more with my parents or just sort of like learning about it in class. But I think it didn't really sort of set in for me until I was older and someone had said it very directly to my as a form of an insult. And that's when, for me, it became the sort of thing where I realized, okay, like, not only is this something that's not part of the past, it's not just something that's should have been eradicated with the civil rights movement, but it's very much like a very real, alive word that people still use to this day.
The N-word is still used in pop culture, music, movies, comedy, and it's tied to efforts to reclaim it, as we were talking about with Dr. Lester earlier. We get more insight from Britt.
I think it's really important, and knowing and recognizing that the original use of the N-word was reclaimed by the Black community, and it happened, sort of right around the sort of time of the end of the civil rights movement. Right, so it happened in the 70s. It grew in popularity through the rise of the hip hop movement. It continued in the 90s, and now it's sort of very much a part of young people's lexicon. And so in that sense, it's very much sort of ingrained in how some people in the Black community communicate with each other. I think that it is not something that every person in the Black community uses, and so because of that, I think it's wrong or dangerous to assume that just because a large majority of people of a certain age are using it, that everyone can then sort of use it. It's that's not the case, and from my personal experience and experience of other Black people that I know, they don't use it as well. So it's one of those things where it's part of the way in which we communicate with each other, but it's not necessarily a part of how we all communicate with each other, if that makes sense. It's in the Black community, but it's not the only thing that's a part of the Black community.
The N-word is used within the Black community, and Britt thinks people outside that community shouldn't use it. But what if someone who is completely distant from that American history uses it? Like someone from KL, for example. Can non-Americans use the N-word for fun and as a term of endearment simply because we are not as connected to its history? We find out after this. You're listening to Lingo on the Evening Edition, BFM 89.9.
Brainy, fancy material. BFM 89.9.
Hello, you're listening to the Evening Edition. I'm Kelvin Yee. This is Lingo. We continue our conversation with Britt Julius on the N-word and its usage.
Being sued is not a good thing.
Hey, Turk.
What's up?
You know how I'm totally down with the rap music?
Dude, be whiter.
Chris Turk's my best friend. We roomed together in college. We roomed together in med school. Hell, we even got accepted by the same hospital. Here's the thing. Tupac, DMX, Dr. Dre. In most of their songs, these artists use an extremely volatile racial slur. The N-word.
I got it.
Right. My question is this. If we're both singing along and knowing that otherwise I would never use the word, am I allowed to say?
No.
See, that's good for me to know. I didn't know that.
Some people might say that if only Black people can use it, it's kind of a double standard. What are your thoughts on this?
I don't really think it's a double standard at all. I think that in reclaiming words, people who are from marginalized communities who are reclaiming those words, they're doing it to gain a new sense of power. And so, and they're doing it to sort of eradicate the previous power in terms of being derogatory or demeaning that the word had. And so it really should be a word that is used within the community of people in which the original word was a method of discrimination or insult. it shouldn't be something that people who didn't really have to face that or don't really have to face that, it shouldn't be a word that they are allowed to use. They don't have the history behind it. They don't have the personal identity behind it in order for them to then be able to reclaim the word and use it in the way that they talk to each other. It's the same sort of thing in which, for example, I'm a woman, and so I will sometimes, say to my girlfriends, oh, yes, whatever, and we're just sort of joking around and having fun. But in a lot of ways, too, that's a way for us to reclaim the B word, and that's something that, I can't, a man, whether he's straight or not straight, I don't want him saying that to me, because that word has always been a gendered insult. They don't have the right to reclaim the word in the way that other women have the right to reclaim the word. And it applies to other words as well. It applies to other sort of forms of insult. It applies to, whether it's the F word, whether, it could go on forever. But in general, it's not the reason why people who are not part of those original marginalized communities should not say those words is because they do not have that sort of personal connection through their identity that sort of informed or led to the word being an insult in the first place.
So for Brit, people who aren't black in America shouldn't be able to use the N-word. Now, I've heard people here in Kuala Lumpur using the N-word. I personally will never use the word, but here's the thought. For non-Americans, where the N-word just isn't as loaded and the history is rather distant to us, is that a good enough reason as to why someone can use it? We know Dr. Lester doesn't think it's a good excuse, but what does Brit think?
I think it's obviously not as loaded, but it's not the sort of thing that people should be act like they're completely unaware of, that it's only an American thing. But I think that even if it is largely, or sort of largely has a strong American identity to it, it still doesn't, I still don't think that that's an excuse, because in the end, they're still not part of that original marginalized community. And so they still don't have the right to really reclaim it. And so even if they're not from the US, and even if that's not their background, or that's not their history, it doesn't change the fact that the only reason why they know about it is because of this Black American history. And so I don't think that it's a valid excuse. You can't remove it from the context in which it was first used as an insult, and you can't remove it from the context in which it was reclaimed as a form of cultural empowerment.
And you personally don't use it, and you're black. It's just kind of weird that non-blacks will still want to find a reason to use it when you personally don't use it and you're within the community.
Absolutely, and I've said this a couple of times too, where I tell people flat out, I'm like, I don't use it. I was like, it's just something I just don't say. That's just who I am, and that's just how I was raised, and that's just what my family was like. And so I don't, why are you so adamant about being able or wanting to be able to use this word when I don't even feel the need to do it and I'm Black? To me, it's always kind of strange when I hear people who are really fighting for that, because it just doesn't really make a lot of sense, and it seems like a battle that shouldn't even be happening in the first place.
There's clearly a lot of discussions as to the word's usage. Brit personally has some reservations about reclaiming the N-word.
I think that we tend to stop using words when we find new words or new things to replace them. Does the reclaimed use of the N-word serve as a good example of that? I personally don't necessarily think so. I think that it is too similar, it's too connected to the past, and also that the past is still very much the present, right? So it's not something that is completely gone away. Though I do think in general, for the individual or for sort of more like smaller communities within sort of a larger community, reclaiming words is a really important and useful way to sort of gain or regain power when you feel like you don't have any power in the world to begin with. So I think that's what my stance is that reclaiming words, at least in the way that we've reclaimed the N-word, doesn't necessarily eradicate its use, but it's more sort of a way for people in those marginalized communities to gain a sense of power when they feel like or when they know that there's no real way for them to have more power in the world.
So, how can the conversation on the N-word move forward? Should it take place within the community only?
I would definitely agree that it's the sort of thing that needs to be discussed or done or communicated between the Black community. I think that in terms, as with most sort of marginalized communities, it's always really important for the marginalized communities to make decisions for themselves, and then for other people who are not in those communities to listen and to learn and to adapt their practices based on what they think is best for themselves.
That was Britt Julios. She's a freelance writer. Thank you to Britt and also to my other guest, Dr. Neal Lester, a professor of English in Arizona State University. To find other episodes from this series, go to bfm.my/lingo. I'm Kelvin Yee, and this has been Lingo on the Evening Edition, BFM 89.9.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. To find more great interviews, go to bfm.my or find us on iTunes. BFM 89.9, the business station.